because we'll make it available then through Feasta. Certainly, there's a URL that webinar creates. Yeah, that's it. Okay, we're up and running. Okay, so listen, I just want to welcome everyone. I just want to confirm who we have among us. Barry is here, Barry McMullen, Davy Phillip, Mary Skillington, Peter Armstrong, Shaun Conlon, Sheila Convery, and I have a colleague here beside me, Davy Walsh. So you're all very welcome. Thanks very much for coming along. Apologies if this becomes a bit clunky. I claim no expertise in webinars, so any technical mistakes are going to be my fault and my responsibility, not just being familiar with it. It looks as if the questions box is the best way to engage among ourselves. At least Shaun and I can see those questions, and as they come up, I'll try and orally feed them back to everybody so that you can hear what other people are saying. We'll try and keep it as informal as possible. The idea is having good engagement with Shaun Chamberlin, who I want to welcome. I really appreciate very much Shaun making himself available for this. The origin of all of this is the work he did on the work of David Fleming. He edited what I think is an absolutely wonderful edition of Lean Logic. He's waving the wrong book there. Lean Logic is this fantastic, wonderful book that compiles David Fleming's quite complex thinking. So Shaun will talk about that. And then his own book, which is an amazing effort to try and synthesize David's work into a more conventional text, Surviving the Future. And I think it's a great book. It's circulating at the moment among some of the Feasta members, and we've reviewed it on the Feasta website. I did earlier send links last week to various articles and pieces on both of those books, which I hope people had some opportunity to read. But you may be familiar with the work of David Fleming anyway. I'm sure, David, you probably knew David anyway, so many of you may have done. So it's just a great opportunity to have a chat with Shaun, kind of keep it informal, try and engage with David Fleming's ideas, the relevance for today. Many of us come from the Feasta network, but not everybody, and just see what use we can make of these ideas and engage with them. So Shaun, I'll just hand over to you and let you take it from here.
Great, many thanks, Mark, and great to have you all here. We didn't really know, Mark and I, when we first talked about this, how much interest we've had. We've had quite a lot, and indeed, quite several people who are really disappointed they couldn't be with us today, and looking forward to the recording. So that's great. Want to really encourage you all to use the chat functionality through the questions box on your screen, which I see some of you are doing. Really great to see these comments coming in from Shaun, from Davey. And we will be able to do some actual chatting as well. Later we're going to particularly be trying to get this kind of interactive as much as possible, because David's books are really, as those of you who've read them will know, really about bottom-up participatory conversation. There's a real emphasis there around, I mean, what he describes in Lean Logic, because of the structure of Lean Logic itself. I think David himself, he felt uncomfortable with the kind of lecturing nature of writing a book in a conventional way, and he really wanted to get the readers to actually participate in the conversation with him rather than just sitting there and being lectured to. And so Lean Logic he describes in his own introduction as being like meeting a new circle of friends. So rather than starting at the start and working through to the end, you meet someone initially and they introduce you to someone else and they introduce you to someone else, and there's no beginning or end to the story. But the more you get to know different friends or different entries in Lean Logic, the more you become part of that story and the more it becomes something that's really precious and meaningful to you. And so while I've been doing this book tour, I'm really trying to bring some of that spirit into the presentations and invent ways of doing that. So hopefully we'll be able to do some of that today. I'd be interested if anyone who's here today hasn't read or started reading either of the books. I'd be interested if you'd let me know that through questions, so I can get a sense whether people here are already familiar with the work, which I'm assuming most of you are, and that's why you're here. And I'd also what I'll be inviting you to do is talk a little bit about what has brought you to this webinar. I mean, was it that you okay, great, thanks for that, Sheila. So Sheila hasn't read anything, she's using it as an intro, which is totally fine, really great. And I'd like to invite you all to make a comment in there about what's brought you to this webinar. Was it reading the books and wanting to talk more about them, or having questions? Was it hearing about it through Mark? Was it just curiosity? Like, what's brought you here? And that's something that we'll try and build on as we go through the next couple of hours. Just to give a little background for those then who don't know David, his background, he was involved in starting the Green Party in the UK, the Green Party of England and Wales, as it is now. It was back then, it was I think the People Party and then the Ecology Party back in the 70s. He was involved with sort of alternative to the G7 as it was at the time, called the Other Economics Summit. He was one of the founders of that, which eventually gave rise to the New Economics Foundation. He was a former chairman of the Soil Association, and he was one of the people who really broke the peak oil story as well, working with his close friend Colin Campbell in the sort of late 90s, early 2000s. He was a historian, he was an economist, he was also one of the great inspirations behind the Transition Towns movement. Rob Hopkins, who's a good friend of mine, often says that, I mean, overly humbly, I would say, but Rob often says that Transition, all Rob did was take David Holmgren on permaculture, Richard Heinberg on peak oil, David Fleming on community and resilience, roll them together and make it comprehensible, and that was Transition, which I think rather downplays Rob's own role, but does give a sense of how significant these books were in the kind of origins of that movement. And there's this weird sort of timeline around it, in that, of course, these books are only being published now, but David was actually working on Lean Logic for around 30 years. And while he was working on it, he would be circulating drafts to kind of trusted friends and activists. And so they became very influential before actually being published, which is sort of strange. You know, for those who've read Rob Hopkins' foreword to Surviving the Future, he talks about what a massively influential work this has been, which is a kind of strange thing to say about a work that's just being published. But that's how things have worked out. And just to give a bit of background on myself, I run a website called darkoptimism.org, which is a kind of umbrella for all my work. I was involved with the Transition Network from the outset. I first met Rob Hopkins, David Fleming, Richard Heinberg when they taught me at Schumacher College back in 2006. Stayed very involved since then, co-founded Transition Town Kingston in Greater London, and wrote the second book of the transition movement, The Transition Timeline. I was then chair of a thing called the Ecological Land Cooperative, which operates in England, helping people access land for ecological projects. Of course, I then edited these two books, David Fleming's Lean Logic, after he passed away very suddenly at the end of 2010. I took on sort of just finishing things up and getting that published, and then the shorter version, Surviving the Future. I've also been quite involved with sort of a gift economy work. Mark Boyle, the Moneyless Man, is one of my closest friends, and we've done a lot of work together. And now I'm managing director of the Fleming Policy Centre, which, although it wasn't called that at the time, was set up by David Fleming to advance his ideas. So I'm just going to have a quick look at some of the answers you've got here. So okay, lots of great. Okay, so yeah, some people have really engaged quite a lot with the book. Some people it's quite new to. So I don't know whether most or none of you have read Mark's review of the books, which we circulated, which he did for Feasta. But Mark, maybe you'd like to say something about your experience of discovering David's work and why that led to this event for you.
Yeah, I mean, you know, one of the things that has characterized Feasta has been new ideas and generating ideas, and I always think of, you know, David Fleming and Richard Douthwaite as kind of key figures in beginning a discussion on, I don't know, I don't even like the word sustainability anymore, but on imagining alternatives, or imagining, you know, locally based, de-linked alternatives to the present economic model. I'd only a little bit of knowledge of David Fleming's work. I remember reading his contribution to the Feasta review, way back. Feasta, I can't even remember if it was the first or second one, but that's maybe 15 years ago, and been really intrigued by it. But Lean Logic blew my mind. I had never looked at a book like that. It's an extraordinary work. It's more like, for those not familiar with it, it's more like an encyclopedia of ideas, and I was really intrigued by it as a model, because instead of this linear the book itself almost represented an alternative to books. It didn't have a beginning and end. It had this wonderful circular, flowing, interactive kind of thing. I could imagine talking to David Fleming must be maddening if he moves across ideas in the way he was. So I just found that intriguing. I read Shaun's book, which I thought was a great representation of lean logic. I thought he really captured the core of it. I cannot say that I've completed lean logic. I don't even know if such a thing is possible. I mean, I don't know, because where would you? I don't know how. I mean, you can read it cover to cover. I still wouldn't have read it because it's so wonderfully interactive with itself almost. I think the core,
like getting to know a person, I guess. You know, you might have
sure.
a sense of their ideas, but there's always new ways that they interact.
Yeah, that's right. Now, I mean, I would say from an Irish perspective, speaking as an Irish person from the west of Ireland, there is an English feel to it. I could feel an English country feel to it. In other words, a kind of clearly demarcated villages, with cultural homogeneity. There's an evocation of a kind of I get that feeling. Now, that may just be a false resonance in me. So one of the things I'm really interested in, Shaun, in talking to you about is this notion of community and how community encompasses diversity. A key thing for David Fleming is the notion of culture as an alternative way to money, to structure social relations, rather than doing it through money exchanges, doing it through community, cultural-based interactions.
Yeah.
And that's, I love that. I mean, that is a fundamental idea, and Richard Dowswell had similar ideas on de-linking and creating local economies and so on. And that's obviously a fundamental part of a post-capitalist ecological world, to re-inhabit place and people and place becoming harmonized with each other. So I really find that an intriguing idea, but how diversity, gender relations, minority groups get swept up in that. What happens to people who are deviant and decide, feck it, I don't want to live in this prescribed manner, I'm going to live. And so all of that stuff interests me. So that's a topic I really am looking forward to talking to you about. But anyway, I thought that within the Feasta network, having an exchange of ideas around the richness of this work would just be good for everyone. And I know some of the people who have joined us know an awful lot more than I do about some of these ideas. So I'm really looking forward to hearing their contributions as well.
Thanks, Mark. And also, I'd say if there's anyone who feels like, oh, I've got something I'd really like to say as opposed to type, then just if you just type a double exclamation mark in that questions box, we'll think of that as like raising your hand, and we'll be able to invite other people to speak as well. Oh, okay, since we got that from Davey. So I'm just going to check that I know how to do this. Okay, can you speak now, Davey?
Can everyone hear me? I just wanted to say a few words on Feasta's early involvement with David's work. Can everyone hear that?
If anyone else can't hear him, write a message in questions, but carry on, Davey.
Well, I mean, Richard discovered, from Feasta's point of view, David's work and invited him to give the 2001 lecture, which was the same time that we had just had a presentation with Colin Campbell, Dr. Death, and it was the first time really the world, well, my world, has encountered peak oil. And so David gave the annual lecture in 2001. I've shared the link to the Feasta first book that you mentioned, Mark, and David's actual speech there. But just remembering the energy of David, and it's interesting, his books and his work was all around lean because he was such a thin fella. And I remember that first lecture that he was feeling a little sick, and halfway through the lecture he was all, I think we need to take a break, and ran off and came back with his shirt all sort of stained, and he had just ran to the bathroom and been sick, and I was all, David, we can just cancel it. No, we'll keep going, and he went on and completed that lecture. And just so people know, it was Feasta that first sort of released his book in about 100 galley copies, and that's the book that you sometimes refer to, Shaun. Rob Hopkins always says was the best unpublished book, and David carried that manuscript in that book and kept adapting and changing it. Every time I met David, and I worked with him over the years, he did quite a lot on Community Power Down, pre-transition, and in transition we worked with David a lot. He carried that book, adapted that book, right until his death, and it was Shaun that picked up the pieces as we know now and released both Surviving the Future and Lean Logic from that first lean economy sort of thinking in David's lifetime of work. He was just an amazing fellow. I just wanted to give a little Feasta context there of the early days of Feasta and David's work. And there was a little tension, just we can maybe bring that in, between tradable energy quotas, the project you worked with them on, Shaun, and Feasta's cap and share. There was, I mean, Richard and David actually fell out a little over two approaches to sort of limit fossil fuel use and reduce our carbon footprint. So that might be an interesting thing to come back to. But
brilliant. Thank you. Yeah, I think it might well be. What I'd like to do now is, assuming the technology allows, is I'm going to try and play you all a little video clip of David Fleming. And he's talking. Well, I'll let him talk for himself. But what I think is very interesting about this clip, assuming it works, is that it was recorded in David's flat in Hampstead in 2009, so 8 years ago now. But still seems to speak very pertinently to the moment we're in today. So that's maybe something we can reflect on and discuss. And I'm very hopeful that this will work. It worked when we tested it yesterday. And I'll just open it up now.
So are we at a time of a paradigm shift on eco and climate change? Well, yeah, I think like the answer to a lot of questions, I think the answer to that is we are and we aren't. I think we are in the, the world we're looking at is completely different from the world that we've been brought up to suppose is okay. That is to say, the world of the market economy, which depends on growth, which is not actually going to destroy the environment in any substantial way, and which has more than enough energy for the foreseeable future. We're no longer in that paradigm. On the other hand, as Thomas Kuhn pointed out, one's not in a new paradigm till you're there, and there is a long period of storm and stress during which people are becoming more and more uneasy about the paradigm that they're in, and about the possibilities and anomalies that develop during that time. And there is a time of great difficulty and turbulence, like water, flowing from one pool to another down a waterfall. And I don't believe that we're yet in the next pool, so to speak. I don't think we are yet in a new paradigm. For a whole lot of reasons. One is, lots of reasons. One is we, as the people who know about climate recognise that actually it is worse than is widely recognized. Skepticism about whether technical fixes like that would work. And above all, or maybe above all, there is the problem about economic growth itself. The market economy absolutely depends for its structural stability. So there is a question about whether that's solvable. There's certainly a question about whether the energy problem is solvable. Even if one goes down the optimistic route of building large solar arrays in the Sahara Desert and having cables around the rest of the world providing us with energy, there is a good deal of skepticism about whether technical fixes like that would work. And above all, or maybe above all, there is the problem about economic growth itself. The market economy absolutely depends for its structural stability on economic growth. And not because banks wanted big money and big paybacks. It's not because of bankers' bonuses. For nothing like that. It's for no trivial reason. It's just a system which is fundamentally, it's the fundamental nature of the system. We're living in a dynamic system, and dynamic systems are like bicycles. They only stay stable and upright so long as they're moving forward. There is no way the market economy can exist without growth. And so if growth were to stop for a substantial amount of time, or still worse, if growth were actually to go into reverse, then the market economy would collapse and collapse. And I'll leave it to our imagination to imagine what that collapse would mean. So that if one is looking, which all of us should be looking for a time when for a non-growing economy, and we have to have an economy which isn't growing. Indeed, we have to have an economy which has shrunk a good deal, a long way from where it is now. We have to have, unless we can do that, we're going to be in trouble. So we've had it either way, in a way. If we grow, we're stuffed if we grow, and we're stuffed if we don't grow, and that means that we're not in a paradigm. It's very, very hard for anybody, hand on heart, to say this is the way forward. It's going to be perfectly okay. People, we have a solution, and that is what Thomas Kuhn was talking about. He was talking about a comprehensive paradigm with some tweaks that needed to be developed, but he wasn't talking about enormous question marks. And unfortunately, really, instead of this alternative paradigm, all we can offer really is the most enormous planet-sized question marks.
Okay, so I'm assuming you were all able to hear that. I was told earlier that maybe the volume was a little bit low, so apologies if you turned it up and I'm now deafening. But that gives a little bit of a taste of where David was coming from in his work, especially for those of you who weren't that familiar, and of course, you know, possibly quite an emotional resonance there for those of you who knew David and have a chance to see him again there. I think what I'll do now as well, for those who aren't so familiar with his work, is just read a little part from this paperback, Surviving the Future. So as Mark touched on, David's life work was this epic dictionary for the future and how to survive it, and it's in this unconventional. Oh, you can't see me now. Okay, let me try and do something about that. I hope you can see me again now. Yeah, great. Thanks for the note, Peter. First time we've done the video sharing through this, which is an experimental thing, so I'm glad it worked. So yeah, Lean Logic is in this quite unconventional linked dictionary format. So it's in a way like a pre-invention of Wikipedia, if you like. You know, as you read each entry, there are asterisks next to words that have their own entry, and so you kind of have this choose your own adventure feel to the book, which as Mark was saying, it's like a reinvention of the notion of a book in a way. But when I was speaking to publishers after David's passing, they were saying that it's quite it can be quite daunting because it's big and it's in this strange format, and so it would be good to produce some kind of shorter version. Oh, hang on. When Sheila said yes, maybe she didn't mean that I'd come back. Maybe she meant she was agreeing that she couldn't see me. Can you see me, Mark?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. Let me know, anyone, if you still can't see me. Okay, good. And so, yeah, Surviving the Future, as Mark mentioned, was an attempt to produce something in a more manageable size and in a conventional read it front to back format. And so essentially I picked one of the potential pathways through Lean Logic and turned it into this more conventional format. But one of the challenges I faced, actually a surprisingly long way into the process of producing the shorter book, was it was only at sort of fairly late stage that I realized that, of course, a dictionary doesn't have an ending, and a conventional book does have an ending, and so I had to somehow create an ending for a book that didn't have one. And my solution to that was creating an epilogue which pulled together sections from different entries in Lean Logic. And so I'm just going to read a section from that epilogue, which I think sums up David's vision, David's view. The great transformation has already happened. It was the revolution in politics, economics, and society that came with the market economy, and which hit its stride in Britain in the late 18th century. Most of human history has been bred, fed, and watered by another sort of economy, but the market has replaced, as far as possible, the social capital of reciprocal obligation, loyalties, authority structures, culture, and traditions, with exchange, price, and the impersonal principles of economics. Unfortunately, the critics of economics have had a tendency to discuss the whole structure as a tissue of misconceptions. It is a critique that fails. The strength of economics is its considerable, if far from complete, understanding of the flows and comparative advantages that underlie trade, jobs, capital and incomes, and the logic of optimizing behavior, all backed by glittering accomplishments in mathematics. That makes it a powerful analytical instrument so that just a few misconceptions such as a failure to understand the informal economy or resource depletion, can have leverage. Like a baby monkey at the controls of a Ferrari, they can turn it into an instrument with extraordinarily destructive potential. If it were a tissue of errors, it would not be dangerous. It is its 90% brilliance which makes it so. The market's achievements and answers sound authoritative and final, but what is truly most significant about them is how naive they are. If the flow of income fails, the powerfully bonding combination of money and self-interest will no longer be available on its present all-embracing scale, and perhaps not at all. And it must inevitably fail, as the market's taught competitiveness demands ever-increasing productivity and thus relies on the impossibility of perpetual growth. In the meantime, the reduction of a society and culture to dependence on mathematical abstraction has infantilized a grown-up civilization and is well on the way to destroying it. Civilizations self-destruct anyway, but it is reasonable to ask whether they have done so before with such enthusiasm, and in obedience to such an acutely absurd superstition, while claiming with such insistence that they were beyond being seduced by the irrational promises of religion. Every civilization has had its irrational but reassuring myth. Previous civilizations have used their culture to sing about it and tell stories about it. Ours has used its mathematics to prove it. Yet, when this relatively short-lived market society is gone, we will miss its essential simplicity, its price mechanism, its self-stabilizing properties, its impersonal exchange, the comforts it delivers to many, and the freedoms it underwrites. Its failure will be destructive. And the end is in sight. During the early decades of the century, the market will lose its magic. It is the aim of lean logic to suggest some principles for repairing or replacing the atrophied social structures on which most human cultures were built, as the basis for a cohesive society that might survive the turbulent times to come. And so that gives you a bit of a sense of where he's coming from. But for those who didn't know David, he also was an incredibly funny and enjoyable presence around the place. I think that really comes through. One of the reviewers wrote about Surviving the Future that they had the feeling that the author was somehow winking at them the whole way through, which I thought was a lovely way of summarising the book. So I'm going to now play another clip from David. This is just audio, this clip, and it's about 3.5 minutes. And I think after that, those of you who didn't know David's work will have a good sense of where he's coming from. So you should, I think, see an image of David, a still image, and hear the audio, but let me know if not.
And we tend to think, if we talk to most people about this, they would say, come on, pull the other one, this is not realistic. But actually we also need to recognise how crucially important the informal economy already is now. And most of the things, what we're doing right now is in the informal economy. We're not getting paid for this. Our family life is informal, all our friendship is the informal economy. Most of the things which people in our kind of life do are part of the informal economy. We do things for each other constantly, all the time. And if I were to do something, very unrealistic to dismiss the informal economy as being unimportant. So it's going to be a big rediscovery of the informal economy. But it is very hard to summarise.
But how does it? Okay, you're doing a lot of research about how things have worked and you've obviously got ideas about how things could work. But we've got this whole financial system. You're talking about replacing that with something else?
No, unfortunately, I'm not. I don't think it's going to last. I mean, I think a lot. I'm a capitalist. I'm a bit of a right winger to most people's horror and shock. And so I think, in many ways, the system we've got at the moment is not a bad system. I think capitalism is a good thing. The only problem with capitalism is that it destroys the planet, and that it's based on growth. I mean, apart from those two little details, there's got a lot to be said in its favour. Yeah. And when capitalism dies, we'll be on our knees. We'll wish it was back, because it supports a high standard of living. It supports freedoms. From the point of view of freedom, we're an incredibly free society, and that is basically to do with the capitalist system we've got. So it's a wonderful system in a way. It's very efficient. It's based on pull. It's not based on authoritarian people telling other people what to do on the whole. It's based on people asking for services and paying for them. So in many ways, it's got a lot to be said in its favour. But you've got the absolute, there's no such thing as a free lunch. It's got these absolutely crucial flaws, which is, well, the essential flaw is it depends on growth, and it will go on. It will go on depending on growth to the point at which it collapses. It's not necessarily an argument against a system that it collapses, because most systems do collapse in the end. I mean, that's part of the nature of the wheel of life. You know, system inclined to forgive capitalism for being. I'm not really going to blame capitalism. On the other hand, it does. I mean, it's quite a thing to be held. That, you know, quite an accusation. You know, hard for it to live down. The accusation is not only is it based on the ludicrous idea that growth can continue indefinitely, but it's going to destroy the entire planet with it. I mean, that's quite a lot. That's a big problem. It's not a small problem. It's a fairly sort of fundamental problem. But anyway, the thing is, as it is going to hit the buffers in this way, we don't have to go around destroying things. We don't have to dismantle the banking system and something. But whatever we do with the banking system, it will make absolutely no difference at all. We do not have to reform things. I'm not a reformer. I don't think we should bother. We should waste time reforming things. It's going to reform itself, in that it's going to come to falling about our ears very, very quickly indeed. And indeed, the longer we keep the system going, in some ways, you could argue, the longer we keep the system going, the longer the growth will continue, and the greater will be the fall when it eventually happens. The more nuclear power stations we'll be able to build, the more forests we'll be able to cut down, the greater CO2 accumulations when eventually the crash happens. So there is something to be said, actually, for the crash being earlier rather than later.
Okay, so a little taste of David's conversation there, and those of you who've read my my preface to Surviving the Future will know that conversations with David were one of the greatest joys of my life. To be honest, it was such an honour. When I first started working with David, he made one very strict condition on our time together, which was that if we were going to work together on things, it was non-negotiable that at least once a week we would go together to the local pub and have a drink together, with no agenda, with no formal sense of what the talk was about at all, but just an attempt to have a chat and a conversation. And one of my favourite lines from Lean Logic is, "Do nothing that matters without consulting a conversation." And hopefully that's what we're facilitating here. I see that Davey couldn't see me. I've reset my webcam, so hopefully you can now, but let me know if you can't. So momentarily, I'm going to, still can't see me. Okay. Okay. So I'm not sure. Yeah, confirm whether you can see me or not. So I'm going to invite a wider discussion with those of you who are here. And again, if you want to actually, if any of these clips or extracts have prompted thoughts in you that you want to contribute, just hit a double exclamation mark in the questions box that you've got there, and we can invite you in to speak. But just before, strange. I don't know why you can't see me, Davey. I'll try resetting it again. Other than that, I'm not sure what to do about it, and it might come back after the next video, perhaps. So yeah, before getting into the sort of shared discussion, yeah, I just wanted to say a little bit about the reception that the books have had, which has been glorious, actually. Really, really wonderful reception. I mean, just to pick some of the reviews that they've had, a few comments that people have made in reviews. Lean Logic is an incredibly nourishing cultural and scientific treasure trove, compelling in ways you do not expect. These are from different reviews. I've never encountered a book that is so hard to characterize, yet so hard, despite its weight, to put down. The Lean Economy is exactly what we need. I couldn't be more certain of anything. A beautiful book, eminently readable, brilliant. The dictionary has grown a small thicket of bookmarks reminding me what to follow up next. One of the most enthralling books I've read in a very long time. Kate Rayworth, who's just brought out the Donut Economics book, named it one of her 2 books of the year last year. It came out at the end of last year. There is so much more to these books that can possibly be hinted at in a review. A compelling vision of a powerfully different new economics. Kept me up in the night for a week. It's hard to hold hope as things are, but this dictionary is a place I can duck into now and again to find it. I'm something of a cynic, and yet even I feel a fresh sort of excitement coming off these ideas. So real, masterpiece, blown away, amazing reviews. And my all-time favourite, I'm not sure how much higher praise can get than this. One was, these books exceeded my expectations in just about every way possible. If I had to pick only one book to save and pass along to future generations, this would be that book. So that's been, really, really gratifying after all the few years of work on my part, but also kind of painful that David didn't get to hear this feedback on his life's work. And also an experienced Spanish translator has volunteered to do a translation. Certainly, if he's already translated the first, I think, 10,000 words of Surviving the Future, and is now seeking a Spanish publisher to partner with on that. Patrick Noble, who some of you might be aware of, has just brought out a book called Towards a Convivial Economy, which is dedicated to lean logic, which is quite a wonderful thing, only a few months after it came out. And there's I ran a week's course at Schumacher College in February with Rob Hopkins and Mark Boyle, based around the books, and college in Vermont in the US, Sterling College, looking to organise a 3-day symposium in the fall, as they would say, and probably to generate an online course out of that, which will be something that that people can activate with. And Peter Armstrong, who is on this call now, as he mentioned in the comments, we're looking at the possibility with him of developing a film around David's work. And obviously, I'm getting invited to give lots of talks and things like these. So it's really thrilling, actually, to see what an impact these books are making. And it's sort of interesting that they seem extremely topical, even though obviously David passed away 7 years ago now, or 6.5 years ago. So it's really interesting how I guess maybe the world has caught up with him somewhat. Like one thing that has come up a lot as I've been doing the book tour has been Brexit, and curiously, a lot of what David says speaks extremely clearly to Brexit, despite the fact that that was something little talked about. Well, in 2010 when he died, or indeed over the years previous to that when he was actually doing the work on the books. So now, having sort of given you all a bit of a taste of what the books are about without getting into any depth, one of the joys and challenges of presenting these books, and particularly the dictionary Lean Logic, is that Lean Logic is so wide-ranging that it's sort of hard to know where to start. And so I sort of took the opposite approach, which is when I gave the first talk, which was at the Dark Mountain Festival last year, I took the approach of just saying to the audience, which was about 50 people there, I think, just call out any topic at all, regardless of whether it has anything to do with anything you might know about David Fleming or his work, and I will then find something in the dictionary which speaks to that. And amazingly, that worked really well, and I think managed to convey just what a wide-ranging book it is without attempting to discuss all of the content. So I'd like to pick up on some of the comments people have already made. Mark was asking about kind of multiculturalism and different lifestyles and how those interact in David's work. Davey mentioned about the text tradable energy quota scheme that David mentioned, and again, there may well be things that you found either in your own reading or from the clips or that come out in conversation that we can talk about. And I've also got a few more clips from David. Sustainable transport, Sheila's mentioning in the comments there. Sheila, is that something you would like to actually speak to, or are you happy for me to just riff off that topic? And while you convey your answer to that, Maybe we'll start with what Mark raised earlier around. Well, Mark, maybe you'd like to say a little more about where you're coming from with your question.
Let me just unmute here. Yeah, actually, I thought of a more general question first. I'm just wondering, in the very, sorry, I don't mean to skip that question, but not to monopolize, but I think a general question that might start us would be, when you do the presentation, Shaun, I wonder what you think is the idea within lean logic and within surviving the future that gets most traction. What is it that audiences are most reacting to? What is in Fleming's work that resonates most in your experience of talking to people? I mean, what is it? What's the idea that grabs attention, if you like?
I would say it's been probably two things. I haven't really thought about it in those terms. I think the first thing is definitely that people are losing faith in the dominant stories of our culture. You know, the idea that you know, going out and getting a job and working hard and retiring is actually a secure way of managing one's life in a situation where the economic systems themselves seem to be struggling in ways that maybe people don't understand, but they definitely have a sense that, you know, things are not robust and reliable, and that's a very scary thing. And also, you know, obviously people who have the environmental crises of various kinds, and so there's a really widespread sense among the audiences that I'm meeting anyway of there's a wonderful Chinese proverb, if you don't change direction, you're likely to end up where you're headed. And I think a lot of people don't much like the look of where we're headed for one reason or another. And yet, the whole, you know, there is no alternative kind of Thatcher mantra is still a really powerful one. And so I think what the first thing is that people are just really excited to see something that's genuinely radically different. It's exploring, like, what would an ecologically sustainable post-growth economy look like? So that's one thing, is just like, oh wow, someone who's actually offering something genuinely different and exciting. Then I think the second thing would be the sense, as you mentioned, of kind of culture and community, and that I think a lot of people really feel a strong sense that, you know, we've lost something really important in this kind of increasingly atomized, money-mediated culture. We've lost relationships, we've lost community, and we've kind of been trained to think of that as just a sort of quaint longing for, you know, bygone times. And actually, of course, things are much better now. You know, progress is a wonderful thing, and we're in a better. And yeah, you know, maybe we've got this weird longing for what might have been, but really, we just need to get over it. Whereas what David Fleming is saying, no, that longing that we all share is actually the very key to being fully human, and to creating a future that's not just surviving the future, but as Mark Boyle put it, creating a future that's worth surviving, one where we actually, you know, living convivially and living well together. So that, I think, is the other thing that people are really grabbing hold of. Someone's got, oh, it looks like it's you, Mark, had something loud in the background there. And then I guess the third thing actually is the Brexit thing. That, you know, by coincidence of timing, these books came out around that time, and as I was going around, people were again feeling very lost, not really believing in the mainstream narratives. And I think what's sort of exciting about it with regard to Brexit is that, well, maybe I'll say, you know, from my personal point of view on Brexit, it was the first real thing I'd been asked to vote on as part of the electorate, where it wasn't clear to me which way I would vote. I could see both sides of it. You know, from a sort of transition type perspective, I'm fundamentally in favour of bringing control back towards the local, and I'm sceptical of these sort of supranational institutions like the EU. At the same time, you know, the EU is vastly more progressive in terms of certainly ecological aspirations than the UK at the moment. And so, you know, for a lot of reasons, I could see both sides of that argument. And what I found particularly disheartening about the debate in the media around Brexit was that it was so black and white, and so stereotyping. It was just, you know, you're an idiot, well, you're a racist, you know. It was just, there was none of the subtlety that was actually present in the issues, and it seemed to me that nobody almost could vote yes or no 100%. And that the very, you know, reduction of opinions down to this binary was in itself quite misleading. And so, you know, seeing that really binary discussion going on, I was simultaneously embedded in David's work, and he was talking about things like, for example, Elinor Ostrom's work on the commons, and how one of the core elements that's necessary to a sustainable commons is closed borders, closed access. That actually the people who are responsible for that commons need to be able to, if necessary, limit access to those commons. So I'm thinking, well, that's kind of interesting, and I'm also thinking about it in terms of you know, in terms of population and Gaia exit, if you like, rather than Brexit. And in the context of the world as a whole, you know, I'm listening to someone like Nigel Farage saying, "God, you know, we just can't let more people in. It's just completely." And I think, well, on a global scale, there's a sort of parallel of you know, a border between the existing population and the as yet unborn population. And there's kind of immigration and indeed emigration in the form of death. And on that scale, I sort of think, well, that makes sense, actually. You know, we can't keep letting more and more people in, especially as it leads to forcing out the natives, i.e. the non-human species. And so to me, there is a certain reality to limits that we have to respect. But at the same time, I see the, you know, immigration laws as being inherently racist. You know, the idea you're allowed into a place on the basis of whether you were born there or not strikes me as an inherently racist concept. So there's some really subtle, difficult, genuine questions to answer there about, you know, what is the appropriate way forward, and yet none of that subtlety and nuance was brought out in any of the discussion. And so as I've been going around talking about David's books, people have been really latching on to, like, oh yeah, that's the kind of point I was trying to get across in the Brexit thing. And what he talks about in the book, which maybe ties into your other question, Mark, is the importance of communities listening to each other and, again, conversing with each other. And one of the most inspiring responses to the Brexit vote that I saw was a Quaker-based church in London called St Ethelburgers. In the immediate aftermath of the vote, when a lot of people were feeling very shocked, I think on both sides of the vote, they held open listening days where people could just come and say what they were feeling, and there was no responding and there was no arguing. It's just a space where the whole community could sit together and hear what each other were feeling. And I think that kind of healing of the rift is really important, because I think this, certainly in the UK, we're constantly being told that, or rather in England and the island of Albion, we're constantly being told that there's this huge rift. You know, half the population feel this way and half the people feel that way, and I just don't find that to be true when I talk to people. I think people do appreciate the nuance of it. But one of the other elements that David really picks out on is the concept of identity and the importance of that. And that if we don't know actually who we are, then how can we decide what we want? You know, there's no sense that a national interest exists at all if we don't have a national identity. And actually that, I think, is one of the things that a lot of people who voted out have been saying when I've been talking to them. That was what they felt was threatened, was their identity as, you know, Welsh or Scottish or English or British or whatever it may be, is being threatened by this supranational Europe. And it's actually that sense of identity being threatened that they feel challenged by. And that in many ways, you know, at the moment we've been seeing lots of, or over the last year or two, we've been seeing lots of very unexpected election results, whether that's Brexit or whether it's Trump or whether it's Jeremy Corbyn being elected leader of the Labour Party. And I think the thing that unites all of those is this kind of rejection of the sort of globalized neoliberal consensus, which of course is, you know, destroying our future, but is also absolutely destroying the present for a lot of people already when you look at the kind of austerity agenda and everything around that. And a lot of people are just, you know, rejecting all that's there and, you know, voting for whatever seems like the anti-establishment option in any given vote. And again, you know, it's not necessarily that there's huge enthusiasm for what the alternative is, just, you know, there's a huge rejection of the mainstream. And I think David's work captures that, but more than capturing the kind of causes, it's kind of captured, okay, if we are doing Brexit, then what can that look like in a positive way? How can we reclaim Brexit from the kind of racists and xenophobes who've seen that as a vindication? How can we actually turn this into a triumph for localization? I see that the Green Party is starting to touch on this now. There's a report just came out in the last couple of weeks looking at this. They supported remaining in Europe, but given that we're doing it, can we do this in a positive way? And a lot of people are talking about the threat of fascism, and I think it's really important to remember that the likes of Mussolini, the likes of Hitler, they didn't just come to power on an agenda, and of course they were elected. They didn't just come to power on an agenda of fear and othering, although that was absolutely a major element in it. They also raised wages, and they addressed unemployment, and they improved working conditions. And what we need, and what I think David Fleming's work provides, is a beautiful vision of an alternative economy, rather than that awful, fearful vision of an alternative economy. His vision of an economy based on trust and on loyalty and on local diversity, that I think is attracting people who might otherwise go towards that very kind of scary, hard right place, because it's the only people who are actually talking about issues of identity and of community and of lack of belonging. Whereas David's work has really appealed to people absolutely from right and from left, which is very interesting as well. And for me, it seems like the only realistic, grounded alternative I've seen to a future I have no desire to live through. And that, again, rather to my surprise, has been an issue that's come up again and again as I've been going around talking about it.
It's very interesting. I find that very interesting, because at least what's visible in the mainstream, the political opposition to neoliberalism is using a nationalist barrier to globalized free markets. That there is a kind of rush into nationalism, but what I think you're saying there is that there's also a kind of an eco-localism, maybe rather than an eco-nationalism, but an eco-localism that begins to talk about some of the same issues around identity and culture and connection to place, without it being too nativist an argument. That
absolutely,
it's an interesting, as opposed to the old left. Sorry, the old eco alternative, often in the 60s at least, because its only language of opposition was the left, so it kind of got into a kind of eco-socialism with a big state, central planned, ecological economy. But I mean, again, I'm wondering, it's a question, there's now there's also an eco-localism that's not, it doesn't exclude, but it still says, yes, there are natural limits, and those limits include population movements and the capacity of land bases to sustain certain numbers of people. So there have to be some limits to human migration. It's very tricky territory to get into, and very broad.
Absolutely, and that's the thing. It's so nuanced, because we're so trained into this idea. Well, anyone talking about limits to migration is some right wing. I mean, actually, when Jonathan Porritt and I did a talk around David's books last year, Jonathan was sort of talking about how in England we don't really have much of a sense of an English identity. It's much stronger in Wales and in Scotland and in both parts of Ireland. And that he said, well, he was thinking about this, and he thought, what we need is an English Parliament, in the same way that other places. And then he thought, bloody hell, if I turned into Nigel Farage, what am I saying? And it's like there is this sense of some places that we're not allowed to go, and I think that's what's quite exciting about David, is he absolutely doesn't shy away from these issues, and it's part of the reason why Lean Logic is such a complex book, because it doesn't fit neatly into the categories that we're trained into. And he absolutely talks about population growth, and he absolutely talks about movement. And there's a wonderful I'll have to dig it up when someone else is speaking, but there's a wonderful part where he's talking about that we actually I can dig it up on my computer quite easily. He's talking about the fact that we respond very fearfully to the idea of limits to movement for many reasons. Here we are. So he says, in a society used to cheap travel and to the idea that destruction, when it comes to boundaries and the rhetoric about tearing down barriers, is a good thing, the idea of closed access at first invites unease. There is a sense both of being locked in and of unfairly locking out. But in fact, it works the other way. Almost wherever you go in the market economy, you find yourself in the same place. in the globalized market with its shared banality, its fullness. At the end of every lane is a busy road and a housing estate like the one at the beginning of it. You cannot get out of a globalized world because there is no out. Closed access does not mean closed in. It means the protection of distinctiveness. When you are out, you are somewhere else, in a different in. And I think, you know, his solution to the I did a blog post about this on the eve of Brexit, actually, on the eve of the vote. You know, his solution to the question of, well, what do we do? You know, how do we if we accept that unlimited movement causes problems, but shutting down movement is a difficult thing, then what do we do? And his solution, in fact, is to help people discover a deep love of the place that they're in. And he uses the analogy of wind in the willows, actually. He talks about an imagined dialogue between mole and rat in Wind in the Willows. He says, mole accepts that water rats have a preference for riverbanks, but he asks, what's so special about this riverbank? Why is it a better place than any other riverbank beyond the wood? Rat could only have one reply. This is my place. I like it here. I have no need to ask such questions. It does not sound as though he will be easily persuaded to change his mind. His identity and his place are joined up. He can believe in what he is. And it's that sense of home and of place which is really at the root of his work. And you know, if we can recultivate that tying in of community and culture, which has gradually been sort of attacked and rotted away by globalized culture, then it no longer becomes like, you know, the question no longer becomes, you know, how can I get freedom to go anywhere in the world? It becomes much more, well, why would I want to go away from all the things that I love that are here? And in fact, if you look at the main causes of migration in the world, contrary to a lot of what's in the media, you know, most people don't want to permanently leave their home. You know, the reason they're inclined to do so is because war drives them out, or because environmental catastrophe drives them out, or because economic circumstances drive them out. There tends to be a reason why people are driven. And of course, you know, travel is an important thing and an important part of a good future. But the idea of mass migration is actually more of a symptom of globalization than something protected by it.
Yeah, very interesting. Thanks. I don't. If anyone, please contribute. ! And we'll cut straight to you. I don't wish to go on and on. So it's very much for you guys to come in. So please do so with the double exclamation mark on the question window, and we'll go straight to you. But so otherwise,
or indeed any typed comments if that's the way that you prefer. If that's the way that you prefer to interact. I mean, sustainable transport is another topic which Sheila brought up, and there's again in the dictionary there's a whole entry on transportation, which I could read a couple of little extracts from. Transport is the symbol of modernity. Pictures of the future show the land, sea, and air full of fast-moving vehicles. But that is, of course, an image of the failure of modernity, the relentlessly deepening incompetence of place. Local capability has leaked away and collected in giant hubs in which skills and assets are captured and concentrated. In an age of cheap energy and massive material needs and flows, distance is trivial, opening the way to a comedy of errors in which everything starts off in the wrong place. If Lean Logic's expectation of future energy scarcity are correct, there is no way in which that depth of transport dependency can be sustained. The lean economy, which is his term for, as he said in that clip, he doesn't believe that we can avoid the crash or reform things. He believes that a crash is inevitably coming, and the focus of his work is what could come after the collapse of the growth-based capitalist market economy, and what can we do now to lay the groundwork for that. So the lean economy is his term for what comes after. The lean economy will have to start again, thinking about space and distance in a completely different way. Not sure how much of this to read. The transport network needed to support a drastically reduced volume of traffic will not include motorways. Whatever we may think about motorways, it comes as a shock to think of them as obsolete and empty. And yet, the history of transport is a collection of stories with abrupt endings. Transport systems which have reached an accomplished maturity, supported by skilled labour forces, generally turn out to be on the point of obsolescence. The Romans' roads at the end of their day reverted to scrub, and later proved unsuited to the heavy loads and heavy horses needed by the cathedral builders in the Middle Ages. The 18th century's invention of express coaching along 20,000 miles of turnpikes, a breakthrough, paid for by their users rather than by a charge on local residents, reached its peak of efficiency and speed in 1837. Just 5 years later, defeated by railways, it had gone. The fine roads, dual carriageways 30 yards wide in many areas, were deserted. Grass and weeds started to creep in from the margins, leaving a space just wide enough for 2 vehicles to pass. There is now the prospect of the mass road transport of our own day, too, coming to an abrupt end, to be followed, as before, by an unforgiving shroud of grass and weeds. Railways are likely to go the same way. With a steep decline in use, the cost per passenger mile would rise beyond the possibility of maintaining any substantial part of the system. Rail makes sense only where there is the potential for mass transit. It needs a lot of people and money to pay for it. This is not an enterprise which can be expected to work on the basis of local reciprocities, and its energy source is in doubt. If substantial electrical energy should become available from, say, solar arrays in the Sahara Desert, then electrically powered railways would be the ideal transport medium. But failing that, there is a question about how railways would be powered and where the energy would come from to fuel their infrastructures. We may get lucky. It depends on the depth of the collapse. And so long as the possibility of being able to run a railway cannot be ruled out, the inherited rail network is a crucial asset. It would have been even more useful, the infrastructure of localization, had it not been for the errors, pathetic misconceptions, according to the transport analyst David St. John Thomas, which led to its substantial closure in the 1960s in the UK. The prospect of what remains being unavailable to the lean economy comes as another shock. The aim of conserving it, or better still, reinstating some of the lost network, would be a priority, if circumstances allow. As Neil MacGregor reminds us during a brief visit to ancient Persia in his A History of the World in 100 Objects, nothing tells you more about a state than its transport system. In fact, the relevant transport system for a localized economy organized on the proximity principle is local roads, backed by lightly used trunk roads. There may be no alternative to local maintenance, although this is a collective task which, for societies that have valued their freedoms, has never been without its problems and politics, with the quality of the maintenance variable. Local transport may include biogas-fueled cars, buses and trucks. The biogas will be sufficiently costly and scarce to make the use of road vehicles the exception rather than the routine. Some reliable forms of transport will remain: walking, bicycles, horses and sojourn, staying at your destination for a long time rather than going backwards and forwards. In this way, slow becomes fast. You simply spend less time travelling, for you're already there. The unanswerable question at the heart of transport is the one asked by the farm labourer, standing bemused one day in the mid-18th century at the side of the Liverpool to Manchester turnpike, crowded with urgently speeding coaches. He asked, "Who would ever have thought that there were so many people in the wrong place?" Even Illich expresses the matter as an ideal. It is never to be realised, and in the gap between ideal and actuality, the lean economy will need transport. But the ideal itself is, in his words, space that offers to each person the constantly renewed experience that the centre of the world is where he stands, walks, and lives. So that gives you a sense of his vision. And again, his focus is not on how do we reform things from where we're at. His focus is on, well, actually this system is headed for a collapse, and what would come after that. And Sheila's asking, does the lean economy then need multiple skill sets in each person so that people don't have to travel with their skills and services? Yes, I think is the short answer. It would take me a moment to find it, I think, but his vision is based on, he uses Kirkpatrick Sale's distinction, that was a tricky one, between simplifying and complexifying, and he says that the mainstream market economy currently is all about simplifying things. You know, like Adam Smith's, well, if you get each person doing one job, that's far more efficient and you can produce far more stuff because they get very good at it and all of that. Whereas Kirkpatrick Sales argues that that's a huge diminishing of the nature of a person, to reduce a person to just a sort of cog in a machine doing one job repeatedly and being probably bored to absolute tears by it. And there's a lovely little story he tells, David, in Lean Logic, which I'll read. It's a very short story. It's called The Story of Nos and Scarp, which are two notional villages. Imagine that there is a little society with, say, 4 participants. They might be thought of, though not too literally, as, oops, I just clicked on something there. Though not too literally, as 4 small villages. In order to look after themselves, they have to provide 4 different goods and services: bread, clothes, electricity, and teaching. Now, there are 2 ways of dividing this work up. Each village could specialize in just one thing, sending off supplies or transporting people every day to all the others, or each could do all 4 things for itself. If the villages specialize, as they do in the Society of Nos, there has to be a lot of swapping around, and there are lots of chances for things to go wrong. When there is a shock, for example, to the bread producer, it tends to ripple through them all. There is standardization. There is separation between producers and consumers. Transport has to bridge the gap between producers and consumers, as you rightly highlight. It is harder to maintain a closed-loop system because the large-scale production creates a lot of waste, making it harder to sort, and users of large quantities, oops, I've just moved my page by accident. Sorry, back in 2 seconds. And, oh dear, I was attempting to make its scale change and I've accidentally lost the page. 2 seconds. Here we are. Transport has to bridge the gap between producers and consumers. It is harder to maintain a closed-loop system because the large-scale production creates a lot of waste, making it harder to sort, and users of large quantities of unsorted waste are hard to find. This is a society of separation, distance, and dependency, kept going by rivers of traffic. The other little society, Scarp, doesn't like this complication. It prefers complexity. In place of separation, there is integration. Each village provides all 4 goods and services for itself. Each locality contains a full range of skills and facilities. There is integration between what they produce and what they consume. This is a hands-on or hands-in culture, in touch with its own food and its own needs. It has free agency, and the interdependencies between the villages in Scarp take place across a rich range of subjects and interactions. Diverse cultures and solutions can be sustained. Instead of just one standardized procedure for baker, tailor, energy supplier, teacher, there are 4 variants of each. There is evolution, guided by trial and error, since if one village innovates successfully, the others can imitate it, whereas if the innovation is a failure, the others are not affected. It is robust. A shock tends to be localized. If one bit gets knocked out, others can cover it, or simply get along without. So that, I think, gives a sense of where he's coming from in terms of that that question about transport and how they relate. I'm just gonna, I've got my questions panel shrunk for some reason. So sorry, it's a bit of a clunky interface, this one, but I'm getting there. Now I can see. Oh, good. I'm glad you found that interesting, Sheila. Sorry it took me so long to find your comment. And the wider comment from Kirkpatrick Sale. Yeah, Kirkpatrick Sale's comment that David Fleming is drawing on. Kirkpatrick Sale wrote, "I wish to complexify, not simplify. It is our modern economy that is simple. Whole nations given over to a single crop, cities to a single industry, farms to a single culture, factories to a single product, people to a single job, jobs to a single motion, motion to a single purpose. Human organizations are healthy and they survive when they are diverse and differentiated, capable of many responses. They become brittle and inadaptable and prey to any changing conditions when they are uniform and specialized. It is when an individual is able to take on many jobs, learn many skills, live many roles, that growth and fullness of character inhabit the soul. It is when a society complexifies and mixes, when it develops the multiplicity of ways of caring for itself, that it becomes textured and enriched. And that's a quote that David brings into Lean Logic, and indeed I included in Surviving the Future. And actually, there's not time to get into it now, but in Lean Logic, there's a very deep exploration of systems thinking and the relationships between complexity and complication and resilience and concepts like slack and torque. And it's actually one of the most transformative sections for me, where David, gets very deeply into these things and looks at examples from nature, and really draws out the ways in which, and actually particularly what I focused on in the paperback Surviving the Future is his vision of how an economy could function in this way, because as I said at the start, we have this sense in many ways that the current state of the economy is sort of, there is no alternative. This is the only way that an economy could have developed. And what's really exciting for me anyway about Surviving the Future in particular is that it really fleshes out a vision of what an alternative looks like that more and more people are getting excited about, and which hopefully begins to develop some traction and has some influence on the way that the future develops, not necessarily by being taken on by political parties and changing the world through that sort of taking power route, but much more by being an influence in people's minds as we move through this period of crisis and collapse, which is becoming increasingly obvious to more and more people, and just having the sense. David was once asked at a talk that he gave. It was in Totnes actually, and it was a transitioner who put her hand up and said, if there's one thing, what one thing can I do to improve the resilience of my local community? You've said all these amazing things, just to distill it down, what one thing could I do? And David thought for a moment, and he said, join the choir. Because for him, the most critical thing we can do is rebuild what he calls the informal economy, what a lot of people call the gift economy, the sense of relationship and mutual support and reciprocity, because that's what, and this isn't because he's had this brilliant new idea of how we should run an economy, it's much more because as a historian and economist, he sees that that's how the whole of human life was managed for the whole of human history up to this weird anomaly of the last couple of hundred years of the market economy, which has been around just long enough for us all to think it's completely normal because our parents and grandparents grew up in it, but is actually this crazy historical anomaly, as in that extract I read at the beginning, and that because that's for simple mathematical reasons unsustainable and thus is going to end, because that's what unsustainable means. We need to look at what's going to catch us in the aftermath of the market economy. And the two things that have always supported human life are the natural economy, nature, which is why helping rewilding, things like this is really essential, and that human informal economy, which the market economy has pushed back more and more, but is still the core on which our society operates, as again we were hearing from David in that clip earlier. And I'd like to, before taking another question, maybe just play another little clip from David, which addresses, I think, the interviewer. I should mention actually the reason that still picture of David looks like he's sitting in a tree is because he's sitting in a tree. He was interviewed by a chap called Henrik Dahler, who decided to travel around interviewing mainly ecological thinkers up trees. And so actually only a couple of months before he died, he managed to get David Fleming up this oak tree on Hampstead Heath, and that's where these audio clips were taken from. So this is a short clip. This is just a minute and a half, and this is Henrik trying to grapple with the enormous range of Lean Logic, which he hadn't read at the time. And actually, incidentally, the interviewer has since read and has written to me to say it's one of his favourite books. So here's David again.
The title, you see yourself as an economist with an environmental, or I don't know, you're interested in.
I'm an environmental economist, you could argue. I'm a thinker, but the thing is, I do. My speciality is being a generalist. My speciality is going out. In the academic world. This is called. It's an extremely long word. Your tape recorder will probably crash. Interdisciplinary studies. That you say.
Yeah.
I sort of cover everything. There's almost nothing I don't sort of include in lean logic, which is why it's taken such a long time.
So you're a holistic economist.
Yes.
Well, there's a lot of anthropological stuff actually, isn't there?
Yes.
In lean logic, so which interesting.
Yeah. And it could be taken with keenness, wouldn't it? Because having to cover such a wide front, even with the systems of birth, it can be very difficult to keep up with what's going on in all these things. And if I did keep up, the thing is, as I said, I'm getting constant flack from friends and people. People pointing me in the street, say, "See that poor old fellow over there? Yeah, that one.
He's got big ideas.
He's been writing this. He's been writing this book for the last 20 years. He'll never finish it." And then they say, "He's a nice fellow, but just don't mention the book."
And actually, I'm going to just go straight into another clip from David, which I think is very relevant to what we're talking about, which is again a short one of about the same length of that one. So I'll just cue that straight up now from the same interview.
One of the first things we ought to do, if we really get to understand economics, is forget economics altogether. But when you ought to be thinking about economics, you ought to be thinking about people, thinking about well, yes, our relationships, and not even think about our relationships. When people go on thinking about my relationship, I have a good relationship with Beth on the whole, apart from when she disagrees with me, when she doesn't do it all. But I don't spend a lot of time thinking about our relationship. We just do it. We just get on with life, And I think the best relationship about that. And I think the book is all really about getting on with life, and crucially getting on in life in the things that really matter. And what really matters is music. And,
music.
Yeah, and humour, and conversation, and painting, and the arts, and things like that, and having fun, play, and farting about, and generally enjoying life. That's what really matters. Everything else is just almost sort of just a kind of just as well, sort of the needle hiss, as we used to say in the old days of gramophone records. Now, you're too young to know that expression anyway.
Needle hiss, I know needle hiss.
That's it. It's sort of just the foundation. Most of the rest of life is just the foundation on which what really matters can be built. And what really matters is culture and play and music. And those things.
Okay. So hopefully I will now reappear. So again, this is, I think, why David's work is so compelling, because it has this real focus on, the stuff that life's really about. The stuff that we do when we're not being compelled or paid to do something else. If you have some free time, we spend it, play, or in music, or in family, or volunteering, or activism, or whatever it may be. And that's, for David, the absolute core. And yet we've become sort of obsessed with the structures of economics that should underlie that have become, the very thing by which we measure the success of our societies. And for him, that was always completely back to front. He talks about this problem of economism, he calls it, the idea that that people have this. The economics is the only language that matters in terms of decision making, and in fact, he only really, when he was originally working with the Young Ecology Party, as it was, he was sort of talking to his peers about the environmental crisis, and they were saying, well, the problem is that every time we announce what needs to be done, we get told, well, that's economically unrealistic. So he was urging his peers, we need to learn the language of economics so that we can sort of meet these people on their own ground and show them what's wrong with that. And he then went off and got himself a PhD in economics, so he was true to his own word. But the only reason he actually got into economics in the first place was to kind of show how wrong it was getting everything, if you like. And there's a lovely bit in his entry on reductio ad absurdum. So one of the threads that runs through lean logic is these logical fallacies. He thinks one of the problems these days is that the art of recognizing fair argument is in terrible health, and that's something a lot of people have really picked up on in the age of Trump, of course, as well. But he has this lovely line about economists that the scale. Hang on, I'll read it. I'll read exactly what he says. Scale models can be useful for illustrating some of the fundamental economic relationships, e.g. stories about Robinson Crusoe of Man Friday, or about a person whose shopping list contains just 2 items, apples and pears, or cummerbunds and kumquats. The trouble is, some people who learn their economics in an engaging scale model landscape find it hard to leave it. The models of great beauty and complexity which emerge can confirm the richly misleading potential of absurd assumptions. And this was the problem he found in economics, was that people had these lovely equations and models, and they would shape their view of the world to fit it, rather than shaping their models and their assumptions on the basis of evidence collected in the world. So yeah, if anyone, any of what David was saying there, or anything that we're saying prompts comments, really keen to have this be as interactive as possible. It's a very strange experience, this, having no ability to see or get any reaction from the audience. It's great that the reactions we're seeing are positive, but it's a slightly unsettling feeling of speaking into the void. So
it is very strange, and we're not experts on it. So we are coming to the final phase now, the last half hour at most.
Mm-hmm.
There's actually a very important theme that last quote you showed, Shaun, that I think is worth highlighting for people less familiar with David's work.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things is that often speaking about the environment and environmental issues, to narrow the whole social change just onto environment for a minute, often environmentalists speak in almost apocalyptic terms, and it's very negative and can be very disempowering and very off-putting. Now, David had no illusions, as I read his work, about the imminence and inevitability of collapse. But the post-collapse world, which is often evoked almost as a further threat to us, this Mad Max, anarchic, social breakdown, on-the-road disaster, David Fleming's evocation of a post-crash world is actually very joyful. And you very much picked up that theme, which isn't necessarily very highlighted in lean logic, but you have highlighted in your book the notion of carnival, celebration, play, music, and the higher modes of culture being really crucial for human togetherness and human well-being. And instead of this unrelieved, apocalyptic misery of a post-capitalist world where we're scavenging and just either reverting to some kind of Stone Age mythological state of being or some kind of post-industrial wasteland, that actually reversions to carnival, which was a very central thing in the medieval world, communal celebrations, all the higher art forms, are the constituent blocks of culture, and culture is the glue that creates the community, and that's the thing that replaces, as I said earlier, the money interrelationships between people. It's actually a very positive, very appealing image, and again it gives us another rhetorical trope for environmental sustainability resilience activists, which is we're evoking a world of greater joyfulness, greater human sociability, higher levels of culture at that deeper level. So it's a much more positive vision. I think you picked that up well in your book, and I think it's worth emphasizing that. You have selected David saying that in the previous clip anyway.
Yeah. I mean, again, this reminds me of something Jonathan Porritt was saying at the talk we gave together at Oxford. And Jonathan, he saw David Fleming as a mentor of his as well, who he knew for many decades. They were very close friends. And one thing he said really stuck out to me. He said, there is no conventional political party anywhere in the world that doesn't have economic growth as the underpinning foundation. But David Fleming developed unique, astonishing ideas about resilience and good lives for people without growth. And I think you're absolutely right. In fact, I might read a section from the chapter on Carnival, well, from the dictionary entry on Carnival in the dictionary, and from the chapter on Carnival in the paperback, which really backs, well, it's talking about exactly what you're drawing out. With the transition from a rural-centred culture to a city-centred one, human carnival began its decline. The market economy suffers from play deprivation. It does exist to a weakened extent in professional sport, but even there the aim of winning is increasingly taken as the literal purpose of the event, rather than the enabling myth. When such critical cultural assets as trust, social capital, and the humour which blunts insult are in decline, play is in trouble. Insult and rough and tumble are now largely forbidden. If an invitation to play is rejected or misconstrued, if a joke goes wrong, there is shame, or worse. Carnival is subdued. In fact, that transition has been in various states of advance or retreat for thousands of years, and reports of its death and that of Carnival's impresario Dionysus have come and gone accordingly. Homer tells us how the art of the ancient dream world lay in wait to seduce Odysseus and his crew as they were about to encounter the sirens, whose bewitching song lures everyone who hears it to their death. Their bodies added to the pile of mouldering skeletons in the meadow where the sirens sat. On the advice of his mistress Circe, the goddess who lives on the island of Aea, Odysseus stopped up the ears of his crew with wax, so that, unable to hear the song, they were not distracted from the real work of rowing. He himself, being securely strapped to the mast, could now listen to the sirens' voices with enjoyment, as Circe puts it, and without being drawn irresistibly into their power. This has various interpretations. One of them makes it a decisive detachment from art. The sound of ancient myth, which once drew its hearers in without means of escape, is rendered sensible and civilized, reduced to a concert, a sort of Hellenic music evening with female chorus and a professor of Greek to tell us something about the local legend that lies behind it. On this view, we see the breaking of the link between art, music in this case, and politics. Now you only need to buy your ticket, be a spectator of the arts for an hour or so, and then home for herb tea in bed. In the 17th century, the decline of carnival in the West began in earnest. There were many reasons. The early stirrings of capitalism encouraged habits of soberness, and it has this fixation about people turning up for work on Monday morning. Some carnivals were getting out of control, becoming the starting point for rebellion and riot. Robin Hood's career began as a carnival king. Ben Kett's rebellion in 1549 started in Wymondham at a festival for St. Thomas a Becket, and the invention of firearms had its effect. It meant, of course, that a reckless crowd could also be dangerous, but, more important than that, it introduced a need for discipline, especially in armies. The loading and firing of a musket is complicated. It requires a sequence of steps, 43 of them according to Prince Maurice of Orange's drill, each of which must be done exactly, at speed, and on occasion under fire. Discipline becomes critical. Sober citizenship, which is good for armies and good for trade, calls for self-awareness and self-control, and it gets lost in the spontaneous exuberance of carnival. At the same time, the loss of carnival is serious. It invites the bleak question, what is the point? The consequences are various, no doubt, but among them may be loneliness, boredom, anxiety, and depression. And if society is less fun, its inequalities are more resented. There is no constant reminder of the teeming vitality beneath the surface of other people. There is a loss of authority by the local community, which becomes less audible, less visible, less alive, less fertile as a source of laughter. Barbara Ehrenreich wonders whether the waning of carnival might have had something to do with the awareness of depression, which in the early 17th century seems to have developed almost on the scale of a pandemic. Before then, there was, of course, pain and grief, all the dark emotions, but loneliness and anxiety, tactical deprivation, the sadness of not being touched, the sense of the party being over, and this reminds me of one of the blurbs. Jeremy Leggett, the founder of Solar Century and Solar Aid and author of several wonderful books, his comment was, "The end is nigh messages are a dime a dozen these days." Fleming's work doesn't shy away from that, but it's his vision of what could come next and the potential richness, carnival and culture of it that I think is so rare and precious in these books. Less what we stand to lose, more what we've lost already and stand to regain if we do things right. And yeah, going back to your original question, Mark, I think that is one of the things that people have really grabbed hold of as they've been going around and talking is, it's not just how how can the world that's coming be a bit less bleak than it would otherwise be, but actually, could it be an awful lot more fun than today? Could we actually reclaim some of those things that we've really lost touch with, and that and I suppose, for me, the absolute core of all of David's work is his belief in the imagination, the ingenuity, the creativity of everybody. That actually we don't need to be told what to do and ordered about and given incentives to do them. It's much more about people deciding together, coming into conversation, into community, deciding together what they want their future to look like, and building it together. And I'm actually just working on a blog post at the moment, drawing on this, because one of the things I'm seeing around austerity is that the response of a lot of people to services being cut is that volunteers are stepping in to run food banks or offer all kinds of services which are no longer being funded by government. And they're actually being criticised quite a lot for that, because they're saying, well, you're letting government off the hook. If you just step in and deliver these services, then government aren't going to face up to the need to supply them. And that seems to be the mainstream response at the moment. I'd actually like to challenge that and say that actually what we're doing is we're learning to be less dependent again. There's a wonderful line in the book, I think it might also be from Kirkpatrick Sale, although I'm not sure, and I'll just find it. But he makes the point that actually all of these services were originally provided by communities before governments came along and sort of co-opted them, if you like, and took them over. Yeah, it was Kirkpatrick Sale. I'll read the quote. He said, Sale. So this is David Fleming. Kirkpatrick Sale, who has done more than anybody to explore and map the subject, offers a reminder of how insidious the displacement of autonomous local institutions has been, and by authorities whose task it was to protect them. Writing of state and regulatory agencies, state services and regulatory agencies, Sale writes, there is not a one of them, not one, that has not in the past been the province of the community or some agency within the community, family, church, guild, and has then been taken on by the state only because it has first destroyed that province. And there is not a one of them that could not be reabsorbed by a community in control of its own destiny and able to see what its natural humanitarian obligations, its humanitarian opportunities would be. And I think that's really critical. We're moving into a time where if we try and cling on to dependence on the market economy and to government subsidy, we're going to be continually disappointed, because much as we might like to think that it's just sort of conservative ideology that's leading towards this austerity program, and that's absolutely a contributing factor, and that's absolutely something that needs to be challenged. Nonetheless, those of us in this conversation are probably well aware that there are fundamental barriers against which our economy is running, whether that's ecological, environmental, climate, energy, all of these things are running up against very real limits. I often like to say the only political system that really works is not capitalism and it's not communism, it's nature. And actually all of our political systems and ideologies are just toying with the surplus that nature provides. And as we're increasingly degrading that natural economy, our ability to continue to provide services in the way that we used to will inevitably diminish, no matter how governments change. And it's in times like this that we see messages like "Make America Great Again," just vote for me and I will turn back the tides. And we know that's not going to happen, but nonetheless, someone promising it can gain some short-term popularity through doing so. And so I think, and certainly what David argues, and I would firmly agree, is all we need to do is learn again how to rely on ourselves and each other rather than on money and centralized funding. And that actually what's sort of exciting about that, and this comes out a lot in Lean Logic as well, is that a lot of the things that we've lost, a sense of community, they come from relying on each other. And part of my experience, running, being on the steering committee, the management committee of Transition Town Kingston for many years, and seeing the transition movement grow from its origins, one of the challenges that transition faces is that it's all about, it's built on David Fleming's work, and it's all about trying to rebuild this community. But very often it gets reduced to sort of, well, let's meet at 6 o'clock on a Thursday and do community. And that isn't really what community is. You know, the only way in which community really builds in a deep way is when you're relying on each other for things. So, you know, that's why I find it quite exciting when people are doing things like gift circles within their transition communities. So, you know, someone will say, God, you know, my husband broke his leg and I can't drive and I don't know how we're going to get around. And someone else says, oh, well, you know, I can drive you around. And they say, oh, well, I could, you know, come and do your cleaning for you because you're really struggling to find time for that. Or I could, you know, offer this service free so that you don't have to pay someone else to do it, or whatever it is. And in that way, people are actually starting to rely on each other in a way that actually that's what grows deep, intimate relationships, is relying on each other. And without that, there's always the sense that, well, yeah, I'm sort of committed to this community idea in principle, but if it gets difficult, I'll just leave, you know. Whereas when there's actually that need to get on, to actually work through difficult things and make them work, then things become real. Oh, someone's got something loud and needs muting. And so, yeah, that sense of, well, actually, let's step up in these times of austerity. Let's provide these services for each other. Let's get government out of the loop so that we feel less dependent on them, so that we can actually get on with the things we want to do rather than asking permission from on high for doing them. That really is the kind of core ethos of David's work. And we've just got a little over 15 minutes left, so I've got one last clip from David that I'd like to play that speaks to that, which again is a very short clip, only about a minute. And this is again from this interview up a tree, and I think he was asked about the transition movement and what he thought about it. So I'll just cue that up.
The government is still thinking about incentive schemes,
Right.
because they say that, you know, people people won't actually do anything unless they're treated like donkeys, you know, with the carrot and the stick. Well, actually, we're not donkeys, and if we're treated like donkeys, then we'll behave like donkeys. If we're trusted, you know, to do something, you know, which works, that is, say, which we want to do, then the thing is completely different. And lean logic is to a very large extent based on that. It's saying actually, it's treating human beings with respect for people having imagination, to use your word, and intelligence and judgment and motivation. And what we're doing is unleashing, the great unleashing that I'm interested in is unleashing the imagination of people so they can get on and build their own future, which I think a lot of people are prepared to do, and the transition movement is an indication of how prepared they are.
Right. So, yeah, as you said, you know, it's that unleashing of imagination, and that's partly why, as I was saying earlier, with regard to Brexit and the economy, that's part of why I feel so proud to have played a part in bringing these books to light, because I think they, by presenting a radically different alternative, which is nonetheless economically robust and indeed historically based, this kind of economy that David's talking about is the kind of economy that most of human history was based around. It then provides people, I think, with a stimulus to that imagination, because they start to think, wow, you know, here's a different framework around which I can start building my creativity. I've had, for example, several people get in touch to say that they've started businesses inspired by Surviving the Future, which is really nice, because they saw that, you know, they wanted to play a part in rebuilding that kind of an economy. And so I find that quite a nourishing and exciting thing. And I think what's really particularly great about David's work is that although he had no doubt at all about the imminent collapse over the early decades of this millennium, he said by 2030 of the growth economy ceasing to grow, and as he says, a growth economy is like a bicycle. If it stops moving forward, it falls over. And he was very sure that was happening. But what's really important in his work is that he emphasizes you don't need to agree with him on that, because actually the rebuilding of the informal economy of friendship, of collaboration, of community is actually something that makes our lives better now. It's not just a preparation for what's coming later. It's actually something we're deeply yearning for and deeply wanting to be. And it will absolutely be unleashed when there's no longer the mainstream economy there in the way that it currently is, in its overbearing way, where it kind of dominates everything, and where there's much more of a need for other things. In the entry on local currencies, for example, he talks about how local currencies can seem a bit unexciting at the moment, because you're like, well, we don't really need this. You know, we've got the pound or the euro or whatever. Like, what's the kind of point of it? And he draws the analogy with a spare tire in a car, and he says, you know, if a Martian came down and found a car, he'd think, well, what's this thing for? You know, it's completely redundant. It doesn't seem to do anything. I took it out. The car worked perfectly well without it. It's just, what's the point of it? And then one of the other wheels breaks, and suddenly it becomes very obvious what it's for. And you know, one of the problems with our mainstream economy is that it thinks efficiency is removing all redundancy. But actually, redundancy is a really important part of resilience. It means that if something fails, you've got a replacement. And local currencies are like that. If we can build the essential infrastructure of those local currencies, then if and when the mainstream currency collapses, then you know what to do. You just, oh well, that's fine, we'll just trade in this thing. But if there's nothing there, then then things get a lot more difficult. And so that's why, you know, rebuilding these things now makes sense, even if the collapse isn't coming. But if you think it might be coming, it's absolutely a critical priority. So I'm aware we've only got 15 minutes left now. I'd like to end, not quite yet, but I'd like to end with a little reading from David. But Mark, I don't know if you had any concluding thoughts or anything to say about any of the threads that have emerged.
No, I think I commend you for, I mean, it's a very difficult format. I mean, this is quite new to me, the webinar format. So, as you say, speaking in the way we're speaking, almost ex cathedra without much feedback, is a bit disconcerting. But no, I think this is such a huge.
Also, anyone else who has any thoughts that have emerged, please throw them in. Others want to hear. But carry on, Mark.
Yeah, I see Sheila's in with a question there, and perhaps that's the funny enough, that was the one last thing I was going to say.
Okay.
I was going to ask, I don't know the answer to it. The question Sheila's posing is, can we suggest specifics for the Irish situation, current politics? And I suppose that's something that does interest me, how we translate the depth of Fleming's ideas and your development of them subsequently into something that maybe it's the wrong thing to say mobilizes people politically, but at least communicates to people the sense of a viable, positive, happy alternative that really is compelling in some way, because I think that's inside lean logic there. You might have to work a bit to discover it and get away from this awful bind of growth. We either have a right-wing version of growth economics with neoliberalism, or there's a left-wing version of growth economics through central planning, and then there's the alternative, some kind of new emerging quasi-fascist, nationalist, awful thing that has arisen. And green movements or green politics or environmental thought seems so marginal to current debates at the very time when the whole situation is becoming worse and worse. That's really difficult. And I know a lot of people in the Feasta network, and again, maybe David, this is something you have some thoughts on as well. Are, you know, people are getting burnt out, they're exhausted, they don't know how we can advance these ideas in the hope that people might have thought about 20 years ago, where there seemed to be more space for talking about this kind of thing. So that's a rambled answer. I don't have a coherent answer to it, but I do think
I could say some stuff to that as well.
Yeah, good, but great resources for trying to recover something. And Davey has something here.
Yeah, well, I'll just respond to.
Oh, sorry, Davey or Sheila.
Yeah, I mean, so I think you're right. You know, personally, I've always found the sort of the right-wing focus on you know, corporations basically as being the main actors, and the left-wing focus on the state as being the main actors. I found both very uninspiring. I think David's vision, very briefly, on that is based around the commons, based around commoning, which is you know, a totally different concept from either of those. and one that I find very much more inspiring. What's very interesting, I think, about Sheila's question is that, so David did obviously was involved in founding the Ecology Party, as it was the Green Party now in the UK. There's a quote from Caroline Lucas, MP, who's the co-leader of the Green Party now, who describes this as Fleming's beautifully written and nourishing vision of a post-growth economics grounded in human scale, culture and community rather than big finance is both inspiring and ever more topical. And of course, David himself engaged with politics a lot. And one of, Davey mentioned earlier, his tradable energy quotas tax scheme, which I won't talk much about now because we don't have time, but that was something I was very involved with advocating for politically, and we got as far as a UK government feasibility study being done into the scheme, and essentially it was sort of carbon rationing approach, I think you could say. And what was very interesting to see firsthand for me was that basically the Treasury stamped on that very hard, because they recognised eventually that if you basically it's the decoupling thing that people talk about isn't really happening, and so if you do really reduce emissions at the rate, I mean, in the UK we have this Climate Change Act which sets more ambitious targets than most countries, though far less ambitious than climate science demands, but nonetheless the government is kind of bluffing in the sense that they recognise that what the public want is to be told that climate change is being dealt with and not asked to do anything about it. And so in that sense they're doing a very good job of giving the public what they want, and Tex in a sense would have been calling their bluff. It would have been a way. And our argument politically was, well, all Tex would do is provide a way of implementing our existing legally binding targets. So, you know, what's not to like? But of course, what's not to like is that the government don't want their bluff called. They want to be able to say they've set these ambitious targets, not have any real plan for delivering them at all, as the Climate Change Committee will tell you. And so, you know, that was David's way of engaging with that. I was quite involved with that. And to answer Sheila's question, I found, well, after that was rejected, I thought, okay, so mainstream politics isn't really ready for these ideas yet, and consequently that's why on some level I decided, well, I'm going to step back, I'm going to bring David's kind of wider vision to the world in the form of these books, and then that hopefully starts to get these ideas into people's heads, and then they will start popping up in mainstream politics in ways that I can't possibly predict. But the idea of just, you know, pushing this through mainstream politics, I think really, I mean, unless the Irish situation is vastly different from what we have here, I really don't think that's happening right now. And of course, as David said, you know, he's not a reformer. In David's opinion, politics will be changed drastically as the economic system continues to unravel. And really, we're not going to be able to speed that up or slow that down terribly significantly. And so the focus, as Davey says, is to get on with things at the local level, get on with rebuilding that informal economy, get on with the work they're doing at Clock Jordan, where David spoke, and you know, Davey was saying that his work was something that was quite influential, I think, on Clock Jordan's development. And you know, I was over at Clock Jordan last year with Davey, and you know, that's a great example of let's get on with rebuilding our informal economy locally. Let's get on with developing this stuff, and then, you know, by all means, as people continue talking about that, then politicians come along. I mean, like we had when we created the transition movement, Ed Miliband at the time was the Secretary of State for Energy and Climate, and he asked to come and speak at our transition conference in, not sure, maybe it was 2009, something like that. And we said, no, you can't come as a keynote speaker, but you can come as a keynote listener if you like. And so he came along, and you know, was just really interested to see. Apparently, at that time, the Transition Handbook was in the top 5 books that MPs were reading on holiday, and that was really interesting. That, you know, Transition had explicitly said, we're not a lobbying organisation, we're not a campaigning organisation, we're a get on and do stuff organisation. And I think the two things we're always told to do to try and sort of change the world are, you know, lobby your politicians and personal lifestyle change. And actually they're both really depressing on many levels, because, you know, you lobby your politicians and you get ignored and you think, oh, great. You know, you might transform your personal lifestyle completely, and that's a great thing to do, and it might be a deeply nourishing and satisfying thing to do, but you're still left with this sense of, well, it's a drop in the ocean, and, you know, the world's just barring on without me. And part of the genius, I think, of David's work, and this was carried forward in practice by Transition, is that it provides a third way there as well. It provides actually get together with your community so that you're operating on a scale where your say actually makes a difference. Your contribution is actually important. But because you're operating with a bunch of people, you can actually make a difference on a scale that's big enough that it's important. You know, you can get real changes made in your local community. And actually you find out that, you know, maybe you want to, I don't know, change the road layout locally or something for some reason, and you think, well, gosh, we're going to need to get the council on board with this, and you go and try and have a meeting with the council, and you find out they've been sitting around having meetings saying, how do we get the local people engaged with these issues? And so when you come along and knock on the door, it's often like knocking on an open door, and they say, oh, wow, great, you know, come on in, let's talk. And so I think very often the shift the logjam in mainstream politics is to get on with doing stuff at the community level, just as David says. So I've got 5 minutes left. I'd just like to give David the last word, since it's ultimately his work that's brought us all to this wonderful conversation. And again, so one of the threads that runs through his work is this sense of these logical fallacies that infect lots of our conversations, that we think we're saying things that make sense when actually we haven't really thought them through. I'd like to read a couple of those actually, and one is titled Implicature, which he defines as the presence of a subtext, another meaning, which makes a statement not quite as simple or as innocent as it looks. For example, what did you think of that singer? Well, I liked her dress. Or, we are tackling the problem of global warming. Well, there's nothing wrong with the statement itself, but it implies that we're on the way to solving the problem. It may also be taken to imply that we can do the job on our own. It sounds reassuring, but it may be telling you that the efforts to tackle global warming are not having much success. The philosopher Paul Grice, who coined the word implicature, pointed out that it is commonplace in conversation and comes in many forms. Given its potential to mislead, he argued for a code of good conduct in conversation, which he called the cooperative principle. Be as formative as required, but no more. Do not say things which you believe to be false or for which you have no evidence. Be relevant, avoid obscurity and ambiguity. Be brief and orderly, except when you're not. Lean logic advocates asides, long-windedness if it comes with a story, frank untruths if there is a reasonable chance that the other person can untangle the irony, broken logic if it reflects the difficulty of explaining things which break your heart or are hard to understand. It does not share the modest self-restraint which we find in Psalm 131. Quote, I do not exercise myself in great matters which are too high for me. Lean logic finds that when dealing with great matters, it can, from time to time, be a good thing if there are cracks and faults in the argument, for the repair of which help is invited. It is a reminder that a conversation is a cooperative affair, not just a series of beautifully manicured statements. Hence my desire to keep everything as interactive as possible. And I'd like to end with his, what he calls the fallacy of distraction, diverting attention from the argument. Consider the proposition that 2 and 2 makes 4. Distraction might urge, for instance, that the idea is old-fashioned, that the time has come to move on from traditional thinking on the matter, or that it's too technical for the public to understand. It could take the form of an ingratiating assurance that the only thing that matters naturally is the well-being and happiness of everyone concerned. Distraction might urge it's perfectly okay nowadays to think that 2 + 2 makes 5, or that even thinking about it means an unforgivable neglect of the far more important proposition that 3 + 4 makes 7. You might be invited to take note that there is money to be made by taking a different view of the matter, or that we have to move on from the notion if we are to be competitive, or that the proposition is a bit rich coming from someone with a private life like yours. Or it could insist with some passion that, contrary to the view that 2 + 2 makes 4, we must take our place at the heart of Europe. Distraction might add, with hoped-for finality, that the argument has already been lost. 2 + 2 is going to make 5 in the future, whatever we do. This characteristic form of distraction is making an assertion which is not true, but which is hard to disagree with. This happens, for instance, with this appeal to the inevitable. The distractor does not argue for or against a proposal. Instead, he simply asserts that it is going to happen anyway, and he may do so in a slightly bored drawl that passes off the sellout as if it were a routine comment on the weather. Don't stand for this. It is one of the ways in which our citizens' right to have a say in deciding for ourselves dwindles into a loss of belief that we can influence anything at all. It is designed to induce give-up-itis, an acceptance that technology and the sweep of history make the decisions. What we are then supposed to do is to surrender, to make sure we are not in the way. And yeah, that's really what David's work is all about, is empowering all of us to take action and make a difference. And yeah, it's not just survive the future, but shape the future and make it something which is far more desirable, far more wonderful than the world we're currently living in, where we very often feel quite disempowered and quite lonely. One of the lines a friend said to me, which David really liked, was, "We cannot not change the world. Even if we take the most down the line, mainstream, do what they tell you approach, then that's the kind of world that we're helping to reinforce. Whatever we do is helping to change the world in one way or another." So on that note, thank you very much all for your participation. It's been an absolute delight for me in a whole new format. Thanks for your comments. Thanks for the comments that are coming in now. I don't know whether anyone has any thoughts on the format, anything that would have worked better or didn't work well or did work well, or whether it would be worth organising another one of these, or whether it's, you know, not a good thing. Any thoughts like that would be very welcome, again, through the usual format. Other than that, thanks for joining. We will great, Sheila, that's good to hear. I'll post the link I'll send you, which is the best place to get copies, although I guess you may have a local bookstore that you want to buy it through, but this is the link for more information on the books, and also for buying the books if you want to do so. There are links there to the cheapest non-Amazon places that are selling the book. Wordery is good, or and yeah, Peter, yeah, we'll be putting the recording up online. I will put that link on the tour page on darkoptimism.org, and I'll also send it out through my Twitter, which is @darkoptimism. Incidentally, the books themselves have their own Twitter account now, which is, if you search Lean Logic on Twitter, for those of you on Twitter, the account is @LeanDictionary, and all the updates on the activities happening around the book are going out through there. Oh, Barry, I didn't realise you were unable to see other people's comments and questions. That's a real shame.
Yeah, that is a shame. In our trial run yesterday, the chat function worked perfectly well, so I have no idea why it didn't. So really, apologies for that, because I actually thought you could see all the questions as well as people were coming in. So that's quite a shame. There's a number of Davey have asked who else has been involved. Davey, Sheila Convery, who has put in a lot of comments, Barry McMullen, Peter Armstrong, Mary Skillington. We had earlier Sean Conlon and Graham Barnes. They left a bit earlier because they were both travelling. Davey Walsh was a colleague of mine who was sitting over my show. Every now and again you might have seen me talking over there. There was somebody beside me just off screen, and people were making questions throughout. So I thought you had all seen the questions, so that's a mistake on our part, and we should have checked that you could see those questions coming through. So that's a technical error. That wasn't great. But anyway, we will.
Yeah, thank you for that, Barry. As you say, it's a technicality we absolutely need to fix. But I think this is definitely something I've enjoyed, and I think we could run again sometime.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a clunky format. We'll try and perfect it a little bit to make it more interactive. This is one platform. I absolutely concede I'm not a technical oriented person when it comes to this kind of stuff, so I just need to work a little bit and be more familiar with this.
Well, you're in David Fleming's camp on that. He absolutely wasn't either.
Not good. Anyway, people are coming back with slightly more positive comments about the format. I think I really, just on behalf of everyone, I'm sure, want to thank you, Shaun. That was somebody has said here a tour de force of extempore comments, and that was absolutely true. You kept going. It was fantastic, and your command of lean logic and knowledge of it is incredible. So I want to thank you very much. Brilliant, really excellent, and it's such a stimulating set of ideas. So if this encourages people to really explore Fleming's work, great. And hopefully we will do something more. Let's see. I'll email everybody. A lot of people couldn't make it, and they want to see they want to see the recording. So once I set that up, I'll email everyone. We'll get feedback on it, and we'll see can we do something else and what more we can do with it. So thanks very much.
Take a bow with Barry applauding loudly over there in the corner.
And thanks everybody for enduring it, even if it wasn't as interactive, obviously, as we would have wanted it to be, which is a pity. But hopefully you got something out of it. Let's call this episode 1, and we'll do more in due course. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording now, so the recording is over. That's it. Kaput.